So with all our priming and our zenithing all done, let's take a quick look over this. So the white has been used to highlight sort of the key features and sort of shapes on the model, and hopefully the step that we're moving on to now will show you how much dividends that will pay us now as we start to use contrast paint. So we're going to be starting with all the wood here, so all this sort of gnarled old tree that's been grown on to this, well, it looks like a carriage that's made of stone and big timbers and stuff like that. We're about to see if this works. So for the wood for the tree, we're going to be using contrast paint wildwood. There's not a lot of this left because Warren stole a lot of it for some other projects. So if I run out, I'm going to have to go get another pot. Not a big deal though. We're using a nice big brush to apply it with as well, and let's scoop out some of it onto our palette. And you can see just how dark this is. It's actually kind of thick. I think he's left the pot open for a while, so we're going to have to add a bit of contrast medium just to liven it up a bit. So let's add some contrast medium to that mixture, and let's see if we can liven this up a bit. I think that looks a bit more fluid now. That's great. Let's just pick some areas out and just start applying it pretty heavily over all of that area. We're not too worried about getting any onto this because I'm going to do this in a traditional style. We're going to use some regular metallic paints and washes to sort that out. But I want the tree to have a very low contrast. I don't want it to look like it's one of the key features of the miniature. I want it to be there as the structural piece that it's intended to be. So using wildwood, I'm hoping to bring that down and let the airbrush highlighting do a lot of the work for me. Now obviously there'll be detail areas that we're going to pick out, teeth, mouths, that sort of stuff, and we'll see just how well the contrast works on this being applied in the way that it is. And the best thing about this model is that there's so much detail in the sculpt, it really lends itself to being played with contrast paints. There's just so much for the paint to get into and settle on that hopefully it should give us some very interesting results. And I've been particularly looking forward to applying this colour because I know that it's one of those make it or break it moments where if this colour works, we're on the right track, but if it doesn't work, we're going to have to approach it in a different way, which is fine. There's no harm in doing that. Although, to blow my own trumpet a little bit, it is very hard to see where I've added green stuff now that all the primer's down, so I'm quite happy with that. I feel like I can afford to be a little bit chuffed at this stage. So as we get down to some of the details like skulls and stuff that's embedded into the wood, we're going to be a little more careful with the application of the contrast paint on there, just to make sure that we're not covering that up and we'd have to go back over it again, thus ruining all the airbrush work that we've done earlier. And what contrast paint does really well is that depending on the colour of the base coat, so if you've used Wraithbone, you're going to get a slightly warmer look, but because I've gone through a grayscale from black to white, I'm getting a very cold, dead coloration going on, and that's exactly the kind of effect that I want, because the characters on the model and the actual living beings around the model are what will bring it to life. The rest of it I'm not so concerned about. I just want to make sure that it looks dull and dark and a bit more sinister. So the wildwood is now all done and it is dry, and what we can see under close cam is something I'm very happy with. The effect that this has given with all the zenithing and stuff that we did with the airbrush really has shown up all that nice detail and all that nice wood grain that's in there. You see I've also done the wheels so that we can be sure that we've covered all the areas that I want to be a very deep dark wood. And the overall result is a very deep dark wood, which is really nice. It also has a sort of a deadish sort of look to it. So I know wood kind of goes pale when it starts to decompose and stuff, but I kind of wanted this to look really dark because everything else on top of it should be a bit lighter, and then we'll get up to areas where the real visual interest will happen, and that'll be a lot brighter and a lot more stark, basically. So from the dark wood, we're going to move on to the light wood, which is the platforms. There's one on the front with the two characters, and then there's one on the back which has nobody stood around on it. And I'm going to try snakebite leather for this one, another contrast paint, and I just want to see what happens. And even if I don't like it, what I can do then is later on add a wash to it to darken it down a bit more, perhaps an Agrax or a shade maybe, or Nuln Oil. So let me see, let's get some of it out on the palette here. It's a bit more of a reddy brown, which is going to work quite well, I think. And let's just see what this does. This should make it look like it is a different construction compared to the trees, so that's the aim anyway, and hopefully this should work out well. So we'll go ahead and add this to all the wood areas that I want to be in this colour, and then we'll see how we get on from there. And what I'm noticing straight away is that in the darker areas where it's sort of fading into the colour where the wildwood is, it starts to look like it belongs a bit more. It's not standing out too much, but obviously where it's highlighted, it's a lot more stark and a lot more visible. And again, we want to be fairly careful around these two characters because we don't want to get too much paint onto them unnecessarily if we want to keep our airbrush work valid for subsequent layers. I think that's going to look alright once it's dry. And we'll move on to the back one, this little bit here. So not too much of this colour to put down at least, so we can be thankful for that. And I don't think putting this over the top of the wildwood is going to really affect it too much. It might stain it a bit more, but it's not, just in case you make a mistake and you go over the lines a bit, it's not too much of a problem. So basically that. I think these two colours are actually starting to work well together. As I see them a bit closer together, they do seem to be working alright. So again, I'm just going to make sure I catch underneath here as well. It's not going to matter as much as the other one, but I've got to make sure that I've done it anyway, because there will always be little awkward spots that I miss. So particularly around the edges here, around the sides of these protrusions. Okay, so I think that will do for those two platforms. I think that looks rather good. Now, from there we're going to move on to looking at the rock sort of cementy sort of formation that's underneath all of this wood effect and skulls and chains and stuff. And I don't have a lot of it left, thanks to Warren doing what he does when he goes to a painting project and just basically steals everything. I have some Basilicanum Grey, again another contrast paint, and I want to focus it on the rocky sort of protrusions coming out underneath some of the woodwork. So hopefully there's enough of this left to manage that. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast medium to it as well, because I don't need it to do a lot of work. I just need it to tint the stonework, so I'm just going to have to try and make it last a bit longer and go a bit further. As you can see, it's just these sort of flattish areas here that I want to catch with the Basilicanum Grey. Again, try and work it in and around the skulls without hitting the skulls too much. So I think that's going to look alright. If by some means I do manage to mess up a few of the skulls, we'll just go over them with a bit of grace here. This really is more of an experiment to see what a very bespoke miniature looks like when you start being careful with applications of contrast paints, and see if you can get a decent result for something that is clearly designed to be a painting project, clearly made to let people explore new things and explore different techniques and stuff. And I just want to see if someone that really likes this miniature that isn't so experienced with the painting can pick up a load of contrast paints and get a result they would be happy with. And so far, I'm pretty happy with it. I don't know what that says for my own skill or for what I consider good painting, but it's fun. It's all about fun. And if you're not having fun with it, why bother? Eh? Right, there's this one protrusion here. I'm not sure if I want to make it stone or bone. I think because it's so low down, I'm going to keep it as stone. Have it as a rocky projection or something like that, whatever. It probably should be bone in all cases, but I'm painting this how I want. Okay, I think that will do for that. That's looking pretty solid, and we'll move on to the skulls, I think. Or shall we base coat these big toothy things? I think if I base coat them first with a bit of wraithbone. In fact, yes, let's do a pass with wraithbone first and make sure that we have everything we want to have a touch of wraithbone on it. Actually has it. So I have some wraithbone over here, which again is the other contrast paint recommended base coat. Okay, so I'm switching up to a Wargamer small dry brush. Basically because I don't need a lot of this paint to be on it, I just need it to have enough. I don't need too much. But it's not going to be a dry brush, it's going to be a bit of an overbrush. What is an overbrush, you say? Well, it's basically a dry brush done wrong. It's a bad dry brush, is what an overbrush is. You don't take all the paint off the brush, or a lot of the paint off the brush. You just take enough so that you're not laying down a solid layer. Let's start with the skulls. So let's look at the skulls and we'll get a bit of wraithbone on them. And I only want to hit the upper surfaces of them, so that when we come to add a bit of a contrast paint to them, there is a bit of an actual bone colour on them and they're not just completely featureless. It should add an extra level of depth to them as well once they have the wraithbone on them. And again, if it doesn't go without saying, guys, be very careful if you're doing this step, because that's what happens. You just put some paint where you really don't need it. And in fact, we might actually get away with just doing maybe some of the larger clutches of skulls. Stuff that's easier to get or easier to reach with the brush. We could also like say that, the rest of the skulls are sort of being left in a bit of shade. So stuff that's a bit more open, I guess. Go in and tidy some of that up later. So these growths here, I think I'm also going to do with this. Just to, again, get a sort of a bony colour onto them before we start adding any contrast paint. So it's really just going to be a matter of doing something to them like that. It'll warm them up a bit once you put the contrast paint down, because at the minute everything else is very cold, and this will start to add a bit of warmth to the parts. So essentially that. I'm going to do that to the rest of these little spikes and stuff. I'll be able to show that to you when they're all done. We're also going to be adding some of this wraithbone. Hang on, I'll just do a little bit of it now before I work off camera a little. So on these characters, now remember I mentioned before that because these are more human-esque characters, they're not full-on harpies. I want them to have a bit more of a human skin tone, whereas the harpies I don't mind so much. So we're going to add a bit of wraithbone to these two ladies here. Basically over the higher highlights, so on her thigh, her chest, a bit of her face. So that when we come to actually put a skin color or a skin contrast paint down onto them, they will have a bit more of a healthy sort of normal skin tone appearance. Whereas the harpies, I don't care if they look cold and dead and weird, because they are cold, and I don't know if they're dead, but they're certainly weird. So under close cam we can see here I've added some wraithbone to several details like teeth on the wood, this big eye that's in here, dry brushed the spiky bits, the big growths, and the skulls, and we've added some wraithbone to our two characters up here and our two characters down here, and that's to, as I've said before, just to get a bit more of a realistic sort of look. I've also added some to each of the slaves, and this is one of the first times you'll have seen the slaves under camera, and I want to keep them very simple, very basic, because I want them to be almost as dark as the carriage. I want them to have a little bit of colour with their robes and their garb, but overall I don't want them to stand out too much, because they're not the focal point. They're, for lack of a better term, they're a tool that moves the carriage, so they're not going to be full of pomp and ceremony. They're clearly not. They're clearly not there willingly, so I don't want them to look like they've had any sort of special attention. I want them to look quite dull and quite dark and sort of blend in with the rest of it. But our three main characters, our four main characters on the carriage itself, yes, they're going to have to be quite standy out. So with the wraithbone down, it's now time to get out some skeleton horde, which again, another contrast paint. And we're going to be applying that to all the areas that I've put wraithbone onto except the four characters. So that'll, and the eye, there's one big eye there I want to do with yellow. So let's just have at it. I'll get some out onto the palette here. And this will go down very nicely over the skulls. So let's just start in and just apply that. Again, don't mind if it's going to pull a bit. It should be alright. It should blend in quite nicely once it's dry. If not, I can always take a little bit of Wildwood or Agrax Earthshade later on just to shade in those lines a bit more. But this is going to really add something to the whole effect now. We're going to see how all of this is starting to come together, and I think it was worth the effort going over these skulls with the wraithbone because they do stand out very nicely indeed, and wraithbone really does lend itself to the skeleton horde contrast paint very nicely. So let's just go on in here and we'll not be too careful. So we can see now that we have all the skeleton horde dry, if I can show it stably enough, all looking pretty good. I've applied a yellow to the eye there, and we're going to be applying a little bit of a black into there too, just to get that that pupil sort of look there. That was, let me see here, Eandon yellow. Again, another contrast paint. Looks very good on that, nice and sinister. And I think at this point, I want to start working on the figures on the carriage. Now, I know I'd said I wanted to make these look a bit more human, and I'm still planning on doing that, but I'm going to do it in two stages. I want them to look human but alien, human but harpy-ish, I guess. So what we're going to do is a layer, a contrast paint of a flesh tone, and then after that we're going to do a second layer, which will be a purplish tone. And we'll not go as heavy on that, we'll just use it as a tint more than anything else. So that's what we'll do for these two and for the woman performing the sacrifice. However, the woman that's being sacrificed, we're going to keep her as more of a human-esque sort of tone. Same, pardon me, with the slaves as well. They're just going to get the human tone first. So, which tone am I going to use? I have Gilliman Flesh here, which we're going to try out first, and just see what that looks like. We'll probably put it in a fairly thin coat, more just to see how it starts to look, and then I can look at my purple tones after that. So let's get a bit of that down onto the palette. It's not a very thick contrast paint in comparison to some of the others that we've been using, so that should work to our advantage, and we should be able to get a nice skin tone off these characters straight away. And what I'm going to try and do is avoid the clothing that they have, which in a lot of the cases on these miniatures there isn't a lot of anyway. So let's just see how we get on with this. I think this is looking okay at the minute. It's maybe a bit too heavy between our breasts there, but that's alright. We can dab that away, remove some of it. And you can see now why I wanted to apply some of the Wraithbone as well. It gives the skin a bit of a warmer feel to it, rather than just the Greyseer, which would make her look very cold and I think more unpleasant than it really needs to look. Although we could honestly probably just get away with traditional painting their armour. So yeah, let's just do that. Let's not fight the contrast paint too much here and just let it flow wherever it wants to, and we'll just do a little bit of traditional painting on them after that. Okay, so I'm kind of liking what this is doing. The grey, the black to white zenithing is working really well, and that little bit of Wraithbone is bringing up quite a nice looking skin tone. Again, we'll probably end up contrast painting the see, it's hard to tell what on this arm is armor and what's skin, so bit of a difficult one, that. Bit of a difficult decision. I think her elbows are exposed. Parts of her arm are exposed. It's quite hard to tell, but that's okay. I don't think it matters too much. So we'll be doing this to our 4 main characters here as well as our slaves. We're not going to touch the harpies with this. I'd rather they looked a lot more ethereal, like noticeably more ethereal than anything else. And I think what we're going to end up with is going to be a very charming, very interesting finish. Particularly these two. I'm really liking what it's doing with these two.